Hello, everyone. I am Manabendra Nath Bera, an organizing committee member of the International Union of Scientists and based in India. On behalf of our international platform, I welcome you all to our webinar on technology and apartheid and genocide. Before we start, let me say a few words about our platform, the International Union of Scientists, and how it came about. We, the scientists and engineers, develop science and technology for the betterment of humanity. However, in the last many decades, we have witnessed our research and innovations are increasingly being used for destructive purposes, either in wars to kill innocent people or to destroy climate, ecology, and environment, rendering our planet unlivable. And we largely remain silent spectators, barring a few exceptions. The genocide in Gaza, perpetrated by Israel, broke this silence. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and doctors felt the need to protest. To raise our collective voice, we organized an international convention against Israeli apartheid and genocide in Gaza on December 9, 2023. In that convention, we decided to form a platform of scientists, namely the International Union of Scientists Against War and Destructive Use of Science and Technology, with the objectives to oppose war as an instrument to destroy and devalue life, to counter the militarization of science and technology, and to campaign against science funding for military applications, to promote, coordinate, and organize initiatives supporting scientists and scientific institutions in region ravaged by war, to increase awareness amongst scientists that science is not immoral and that our choices as scientists ultimately result in the use of science either for the benefit of humanity or as a weapon for the destruction of humanity, to promote the application of science and technology for the benefit of humanity, including work towards sustainable solutions to avert climate catastrophe and ecological destruction of the planet, to build solidarity amongst scientists to resist all forms of discrimination, such as fundamentalism, racism, sectarianism, jingoism, sexism, casteism, and all shades of fascism, which serve to dehumanize and create an unequal society. Today's webinar marks the beginning of a series of webinars focused on the theme militarism and technology, which we hope will spark discussion and actions, deepening our understanding and exploring obligations that we as scientists have in the world at this moment of time. It is this particular webinar being live streamed on our YouTube channel, Twitter page or X page, and on our IUS website. You can submit your questions related to today's discussion topic in the chat box on YouTube or X page or on StreamYard. We will pass them to the speakers at the end of their presentation. I now invite Dr. Natalya Dinat to commence the webinar. Dr. Natalya is an organizing committee member of the International Union of Scientists, a doctor and a PhD candidate based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Over to you, Natalya.
Good day, everyone. In 2016, Netanyahu declared that Israel is a world leader in weapons, in cyber, and in water technology. In order to understand what this means for us in the global majority living in countries of Africa, Asia, India, and even for people indeed in the United States or Europe, we are joined today by three guests who have worked on these issues for years. They will open a conversation on what this means for us as scientists. To what extent are our places of work and research complicit? And what can we do as scientists to ensure that our work is done for the good of humanity? Our first speaker today is Dr. Matt Mahmoudi. Matt is a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty International. He was the lead author of Automated Apartheid Report. He is an affiliated lecturer in sociology at the University of Cambridge and is a co-editor on Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. and author of Migrants in the Digital Periphery, New Urban Frontiers of Control. Thank you and welcome to Nath.
Thank you, Natalya. Thank you, Manap. Thank you for having me, IUS. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I am going to be touching base on some of the general tenets of how artificial intelligence technologies are being used in the context of the ongoing apartheid and the unfolding genocide in the occupied Palestinian territories. And in order to do so, I want to first lay out some of the technologies that we're concerned with and maybe touch a little bit on the ways in which they are fundamentally incompatible with tenets of international human rights law and tenets of international humanitarian law to establish the ways in which we continue to see the compounding effects of their adoption and absorption into these contexts, leading to these particularly gruesome consequences that we're witnessing today, but that Palestinians in particular have been subject to over the last 75 years. So at Amnesty, I should lead with saying we believe that some of these technologies are deeply embedded in institutional discrimination and contain technical biases that put us on a dangerous path towards the automation and erosion of basic human rights for marginalized communities in particular. The kinds of AI technologies that we're concerned with in this respect range from, for example, predictive policing technologies that rely on predictive analytics, which use historical data to feed sort of negative feedback loops and, as it were, land us in situations in which you end up perpetuating historical sort of situations of marginality way into and forecasted into the future for particular communities, right down to tools such as facial recognition technologies, which will be the focus of today's talk. In particular, I've been tracing how facial recognition technologies for identification and mass surveillance are very much on the risk of being adopted and spread and developed without checks and balances globally. And we continue to see their usage in high-stakes scenarios, such as for law enforcement, and there's a growing impact on human rights globally. So first and foremost, just to establish that facial recognition can and is being used to intentionally target certain individuals or groups based on protected characteristics, including ethnicity, race, and gender, without individualized reasonable suspicion of criminal wrongdoing. I should also say that currently there's no research to support that facial recognition actually lowers crime to begin with, and yet it continues to be used under the auspices of generating greater safety. Amnesty's own research has continued to show that Black and Brown people in particular are asymmetrically targeted by the technology, and our conclusions are clear that in most of its application, it violates the right to privacy, the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, as well as we've witnessed in the context of Palestine, the right to freedom of movement. The reason why we hold that it's in violation of the right to privacy is first and foremost because the technology depends on a reference database of images that's often curated by mass scraping people's images, for example, from places like social media without their knowledge and consent, or from places like their driver's license registries. This image reference database is then used for facial comparison, or it's used to train algorithms to conduct facial comparison. And because by design, the technology depends on this mass surveillance curation, we hold that it's by design incompatible with the right to privacy. And under international law, any violation of the right to privacy committed by a state must be proportional, necessary, and legitimate. And for facial recognition, there simply isn't a legitimate, proportional, and a necessary case that we've been able to observe so far. As far as the right to equality and non-discrimination is concerned, we continue to see its usage against communities of color and impacts that, again, are asymmetrically skewed towards people of color. This carries out in the ways in which facial recognition has its own technical biases, which means that it's biased towards false positives against especially Black and Brown people, and especially women of color. There have been a number of instances that you may have heard of around, in particular, Black men who have been arrested in the context of Detroit, in Michigan, in New Jersey, and in New York, who have police basically show up to their homes, harassing them for hours on the basis of matching an image of a completely different person. But even if you take out that technical bias, we continue to see that facial recognition devices are disproportionately concentrated around communities of color and communities that are racialized and criminalized. So even if you imagine a scenario in which the technology is 99.9% accurate, we still see that at the deployment state, it's used in discriminatory ways, mirroring the institutional context within which they're being used. As for the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, we believe that facial recognition, and this has been documented for years, especially by the special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, as well as the special rapporteurs on the right to privacy, that we continue to see a chilling effect instated by the use of surveillance, in particular, surveillance technologies like facial recognition, which lead to people being less likely to engage in exercising their right to protest. If people are aware that they are being surveilled and identified by virtue of participating in a public assembly, in associational life, they're less likely to participate and exercise their internationally guaranteed rights. So through this chilling effect, there is a violation on the freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And then finally, as far as movement restrictions are concerned, we continue to see facial recognition being used specifically to modify the ways in which people are freely able to move in space. And this is what a lot of today's talk will also be centered around, because this affects in particular Palestinians and how the existing draconian movement restrictions that they are subjected to continue to be compounded through the usage of facial recognition technologies. So our call on facial recognition continues to be to ban the technology and its usage at large. We don't have, especially for one-to-N or one-to-many facial recognition for mass surveillance, any case study that shows us that the technology's benefits outweigh the clear violations of human rights law. And so those prohibitions, of course, also extend to the context of the apartheid that we've been witnessing in the context of the Palestinian territories. Now, if I can bring these slides up, let me just take us to Palestine and just to talk briefly about the ways in which these technologies are being manifest. So as you may be aware, facial recognition technologies have a history of being used in the context of Palestine, and surveillance, in fact, and extensive surveillance usage in Palestinian communities is not new. Of course, it goes back to the post-1948 period of Israeli military intelligence operations. A lot of these were mimicking the kinds of surveillance that was being carried out at the time under apartheid South Africa. And there was even early attempts at setting up systems of computational biometric apartheid, again, with lessons drawn from what was happening at the time in South Africa, though these never quite reached the aspirations and the goals that we're witnessing now. For more analysis of the relationship between biometric apartheid in the context of South Africa and the automated apartheid that we're seeing in the Palestinian territories, I highly recommend the work of Keith Breckenridge, as well as Saul Dubov, who have been tracing this for years. Now, in the 20th century, Israeli efforts have been animated by the rapid development of biometric technologies and data-intensive computing capabilities that saw the expansion of systems that were able to carry out surveillance at a scale that we hadn't seen before. And we've seen in particular how these forms of computational surveillance and biometric surveillance reinforce apartheid in two ways. So first of all, reinforce unlawful restrictions on the freedom of movement. And of course, as we know, restrictions on freedom of movement, segregation, forcible transfer are all parts of apartheid and how the policies of apartheid are exacted on the Palestinian communities. And secondly, we see how it's being used to perpetuate a coercive environment that's intended to force Palestinians out of areas of strategic interest to Israeli authorities. So that brings me to the West Bank and the checkpoint systems that we see deployed there with uses of facial recognition. In the context of Hebron and the Smart City Initiative that has been rolled out there, you may have been made aware of the system that's called Red Wolf, which scans Palestinians' faces and adds them to vast databases, which are used to intensify surveillance and the draconian closure regime that the state of Israel imposes on Palestinians in Hebron. And just to take stock of that a little bit, what you see on the screen right now is a map of Hebron. You see that it's divided into H1, which is the grayed out area, and H2, which is the area that you can see on the right hand of the screen. And just for some background, an agreement in 1997 basically divided Hebron into two sectors. H1, which is where the civil and military administration of Israel was handed to the Palestinian Authority, where the civil and military administration of the area was handed to the Palestinian authorities, and in H2, which is under full Israeli administrative and military control. H2 is an area that includes at least 7 Israeli settlements, enclaves, inside and around the old city, and that's been historically the city's cultural and economic heart, and all civilian matters for Jewish Israeli settlers and Palestinian residents are overseen by the civil administration, which is a subunit of the coordinator for government activities in the territories, which is in turn a unit within the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and it has overall responsibility for the implementation of Israeli policies, including the deployment and usage of surveillance tools in the OPT. Now, the civil administration is also the authority that is in charge of processing work permits, access to healthcare, travel, the trade of food, agriculture, and construction products, natural resource allocations, as well as civilian infrastructure for Palestinians. And according to more recent statistics, some 33,000 Palestinians live inside H2 with just 800 Israeli settlers in H2. Now, the thing to note that is so special about H2 is that whilst there are a far larger number of Palestinians, again, in an area that's been under relentless occupation, slipping into now de facto annexation, you have a situation in which Palestinians are under draconian restrictions, whereas Jewish Israeli settlers can move around as they please within the area. Within this context, you have increasingly permanent checkpoints, which used to be at the time intended for temporary purposes. As you may know, under international law, occupations are supposed to be by nature temporary, but what we've seen in Hebron is the continued sedimentation of Israeli power exercised on Palestinians. What you see on screen right now is the Hebron Apartheid Project's tracing of how checkpoints have increasingly been made permanent over time, tracing from 2008, where it was just a small turnstile, to now a full-on building with several turnstiles, and what we trace to be around 24 cameras, which use the Red Wolf system to determine whether Palestinians can move between the space. Now, the Red Wolf system basically subjects Palestinians to facial recognition as they enter the checkpoint. And regardless of whether Palestinians have been known to the officers that are manning the particular checkpoint, let's say at checkpoint 56 in Hebron, if the computer doesn't recognize them or for some reason has a flag on the particular individual, they're not allowed to pass. The reason why it's so important for Palestinians to be able to move, for example, in Tel Romeda between checkpoint 56 in and out, is to be able to access these basic necessities that I mentioned before are under Israeli control. Basic services such as access to groceries, access to medical care, access to education, access to work. None of these amenities are within reach, for example, for communities that live in Tel Romeda within checkpoint 56. In order to access any of them, they have to contend with being recognized by an algorithm that not only is tremendously flawed, but that hides beneath it flags and decisions that are often unclear and that are exacting, again, arbitrary decisions on Palestinians without sort of any transparency or any clarity for why. We have a number of examples by witnesses given to us at Amnesty who claim that they have been barred from being able to access the ambulance on the other side of the checkpoint, that they have a number of, in particular, pregnant family members who haven't been able to access the medical care when they've needed it by virtue of being held back within the checkpoint. Oftentimes, the algorithm will throw up sort of a color indicator. It's green, yellow, or red. And if it's on yellow or red, you may be subject to interrogation and detention, often for inexplicable reasons. Now, this builds on as sort of a history within the Hebron smart city confines to test new technologies on Palestinian bodies. This is just the latest in a slew of technologies. We've, of course, also heard of the Blue Wolf system, which was originally documented by Elizabeth Dwoskin of the Washington Post. The Blue Wolf system is a mobile phone app which basically encourages Israeli soldiers to go and capture as many Palestinian faces as they possibly can. The military unit with the most amount of faces captures would be rewarded with various incentives, including paid leave, gift cards, etc. And so you have videos that some of you might have seen of intelligence raids being carried out by Israeli soldiers, in which they go from home to home in the middle of the night of Palestinians and line people up, including children, to take pictures of their faces and feed them into the Blue Wolf app under the auspices of creating a more streamlined ability to look up Palestinian faces in future. So the idea is to populate this database with as many faces as possible to make it easier to look them up when they stop and frisk them on the street, even if it's arbitrarily and for no reason. And we see in East Jerusalem, on the other hand, how a similar system has been used across the Old City. So in East Jerusalem, from about the year 2000, the Mabat 2000 system was rolled out, which is a system of networked facial recognition. At the time, it didn't have facial recognition. It was just CCTV capabilities. It was connecting at a time a few hundred, we believe it was around 400 cameras at the time, to each other and to a command and control tower, which made it possible to monitor Palestinians 24/7 within East Jerusalem. Now, since 2018 to 2019, the East Jerusalem district of the Israeli police was given further funding to expand the Mabat 2000 system to support facial recognition capabilities, as well as to expand out to thousands more cameras. In our work at Amnesty, we were able to find a camera for every 2 to 5 meters walked. They were spanning all across East Jerusalem in the Old City, on rooftops, on the sides of buildings, in the middle of squares, on top of people's homes. And what was eminently clear to us was that this system, again, was asymmetrically affecting Palestinians because we were seeing their usage in particular against Palestinian homes and Palestinian areas. And in areas like Silwan of the Old City of Jerusalem, we were seeing how surveillance and facial recognition devices deployed by both the Israeli military as well as by illegal Israeli settlers were being used to make it more difficult for Palestinians to resist the ongoing demolitions and excavation projects that were leading to the demolition of Palestinian homes. We're witnessing a sort of a double panopticon in which in the center of neighborhoods like Silwan, you'd have a massive surveillance pole that was installed by Israeli security forces. And on the outer outskirts of those neighborhoods, you'd then have former Palestinian homes that had been taken over by illegal Israeli settlers, with also deployed camera infrastructure by companies like TKH Security from the Netherlands and Hikvision of China that were pointing inwards towards Palestinian homes, keeping them under this double panopticon. And we were hearing the reports from witnesses that were saying again and again that whilst people were engaged in active resistance and people were engaged in exercising their freedom to carry out dissent and to resist the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, folks were finding it more and more difficult to do so as they were hearing more stories of folks who had been picked up by virtue of being captured by particular cameras in particular places around the city. So we see in this case how surveillance begets, in this case, illegal settlement activity, and illegal settlement activity in turn begets more surveillance. And this is what we refer to as being a part and parcel of the coercive environment that's intended to move Palestinians out of areas of strategic interest to Israeli authorities and settlers, right? Silwan is part of this project. The City of David excavation project is centered around Silwan, and it's internationally recognized that East Jerusalem, which is a part of Palestine, has been illegally annexed, and yet we continue to see under these cultural biblical excavation projects that surveillance is being further inserted within these areas, and Palestinians are subjected to further fear and coercion and removal. So this is just some of the ways in which these technologies continue to reinforce aspects of apartheid across the Palestinian territories, mainly with a view to look at Hebron and Jerusalem. And of course, the ways in which these technologies also are now being used within the context of Gaza. Some of you may have heard of the CoreSight system, which is being used to monitor how people were moving from the north to the south as they were seeking humanitarian aid, whilst being subjected to slower movement rates as a result of being picked out and identified and needing to be processed through these biometric capture systems set up by Israeli authorities. So even though people were explicitly instructed to move, they were being slowed down and subjected to further possible violence and loss of life as a result of the facial recognition that was being deployed there as well. So this is just to say that there's a rich history of these techniques being used against Palestinians, and they need to be stopped. I'm going to stop here, and we can return to the rest of my points here a little later on. Thank you, Natalya.
Thank you very much, Matt, for a very clear presentation on how facial recognition and surveillance systems impact on Palestinians' daily lives and at the same time enforce Israelis' apartheid policies and further their ethno-nationalist project. I'm now going to introduce Professor Jane Duncan. She's a professor of digital society at the University of Glasgow in the United Kingdom and a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. So I'm very proud that Jane is a fellow South African. Her talk will follow on from Matt's work and focus on one aspect of her work, on how Israel exports its surveillance tech to other states and industries for repression.
Thank you very much, Natalya, and thank you to the IUS for having extended this invitation. It's an honor to speak at what I believe is the second webinar that's happened of this extremely important global initiative. And I think it's extremely heartening to see that there is global participation, which I can see from just monitoring the comments in the chat. So Matt has spoken about how digital technologies powered by AI, and particularly facial recognition, has been used in order to enforce apartheid and genocide in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, I focus, however, on how the Israeli surveillance industry has been externalized and has enabled authoritarianism and human rights abuses elsewhere. And I look particularly at the region where I come from, Southern Africa, where I work with and am a principal investigator on a research project that attempts to track the uses and abuses of surveillance technologies in the region. And in the process of doing this tracking, a number of the researchers have picked up on the diffusion of Israeli spyware, to the point where Israel has become an extremely important provider of spyware that is now being abused by increasingly authoritarian governments in the region. But I want to start out by focusing on a report, a media report that came out quite recently about Israel surveilling the senior prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. And apparently this has been going on over a period of 9 years. And Palestinian human rights workers that have been acting as sources for the court's investigations into possible war crimes in the occupied territories. And apparently Israel has conducted a secret operation to thwart the International Criminal Court's investigation into alleged war crimes in Palestine. Now, apparently, according to the report, Israeli intelligence routinely surveilled current and former chief prosecutors, monitored their sources, and also attempted to intimidate the former chief prosecutor to attempt to dissuade her from proceeding with the investigations. Now, the ICC has said when the story ran that it was able to protect its core evidence holdings from the surveillance and attempt to subvert the investigations. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what about those who don't have the capacity to protect themselves, who don't have the technological capabilities to be able to protect themselves from Israeli state surveillance? Now, also a couple of weeks ago, the South African Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor, had also stated that her family had been threatened. And this was in the wake of South Africa bringing the genocide case to the International Court of Justice. And she had apparently been tipped off that the Israeli intelligence had a hand in it. But we also find that Israeli surveillance technologies have spread around the world to the point where we can actually say that they've become a threat to world peace, not just peace in the Palestinian occupied territories, but a threat to world peace. And is being used increasingly by governments in Southern Africa to repress dissent in their own backyards. As I mentioned earlier, I work with a group of researchers who've been picking these issues up as they've been tracking the spread of surveillance technologies and practices. And what we've picked up is that the penetration of Israeli surveillance technologies has been extensive, and that the surveilled have had limited capacities to defend themselves, and partly because there are no real controls domestically over how the technology has been used and abused by governments and political elites more generally. And a case in point is Angola, and here I'd like to acknowledge the work of a colleague and researcher on the project, Roy Verd, who's been tracking these issues. He's documented the fact that there's been extensive collaboration between an increasingly authoritarian Angolan government and Israeli spies or ex-spies. And there are several levels of collaboration that have taken place. So, for instance, Israeli ex-spies have provided training for members of the Angolan security establishment. They've provided equipment, and they have also offered themselves for hire too. And in examining how these relations have unfolded over a period of a number of decades, we can pick up a pattern of cooperation in Angola, where typically a front man with, on the surface of things, no formal links to the Israeli state, makes contact and then does deals for retired intelligence officers to provide surveillance services. And this also includes using Israeli spy tech as well. And an example where these kinds of collaborations have taken place is in relation to the surveillance of journalist Raphael Marx, who was put under surveillance in this way. Also, Isabella dos Santos, the daughter of the former president of Angola, José Eduardo dos Santos, apparently used a black cube, which was formed by former Mossad agents to spy on Angolan attempts to prosecute her for corruption. And doing or conducting surveillance in this way gets around the problem of Israel claiming that it only sells its surveillance technologies to states, because we're talking here about dual-use goods. We're talking about surveillance tech that has both military and civilian uses. And they've made the argument that the selling of weapons-grade dual-use surveillance technologies is tightly controlled by the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and one of the requirements is that they only sell to states. But what we learn in relation to Angola is that there are spies for hire that have formed companies, and those companies in turn then use the tech when they are contracted by private actors like Isabella dos Santos. And I think the intervention in Angola of Israeli spies should be understood as going beyond pure commercial interests. And we could understand it as extending into a broader geostrategic intervention in the country that involves an attempt at a containment policy against the growing pro-Palestinian movement in the region. And we could go to the point where we could say that Angola, like Palestine, has become a living laboratory for Israel's spy tech startups. Then we can also refer to the situation in Angola as well, where the Botswana Directorate for Intelligence and Security, which falls under the Botswana presidency, acquired Circle's spyware and forensic extraction tools from Celebrite. And the DIS, because it falls under the presidency, has limited independent oversight. And this has led to a situation where it's morphed into a Praetorian Guard for whichever president is in office at that time. And added to that is the fact that the DIS enjoys the powers of arrest as well. So these kinds of technologies can be used to profile potentially troublesome people who can just simply be disappeared as a result of that. And in fact, there have been reports that have emerged into the public domain of the DIS being used to counter opposition parties and critics of the government. And the weak regulatory framework in Botswana has around privacy has allowed these kinds of abuses to grow. We can also make reference to the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well, where the former president Joseph Kabila, since 2015, has apparently obtained and used Israeli spyware to monitor rising opposition and social movements in the country. And in fact, there's evidence of him having intensified the surveillance of activists ahead of the 2018 election. And that election would have potentially seen him being elected for a third term, so that the stakes were fairly high for Kabila and the Kabila administration. And in fact, such was the level of conflict that arose in the DRC at the time that Amnesty documented very extensively at that stage, that it led to security forces killing protesters, cracking down on the protests, banning protests, blocking social media, and eventually shutting the internet down. So it would appear that these kinds of practices, including surveillance practices, continue under the current president. Now, I think at a broader level, what has allowed the Israeli spy industry to flourish? Well, the first factor is the ecosystem that has developed in Israel, where in the wake of the dot-com bubble in the 2000s, the Netanyahu administration subsidized the tech industry and poured a huge amount of public funding into the defense industry, including the surveillance industry, as a means of attempting to renew the Israeli economy. And to that extent, he was following a US model of public-private cooperation in surveillance in order to grow the industry. And there have been limited controls on the abilities of Israeli spies to go out into the open marketplace and to commercialize their skills. So there's effectively a revolving door between the public and private sector, with no real controls or restraints on the abilities of Israeli spies to leave the intelligence service and then commercialize their skills. And this has led to a situation where there's been an active promotion of private startups in Israel, surveillance startups. And in fact, in 2017, Mossad established, which is the external intelligence agency of the Israeli state, Mossad established a venture capital entity for tech startups. So all of this has led to a situation where the military-industrial complex in Israel has been a source of distinct competitive advantage for the country, and particularly when it comes to mobile phone spyware and drones. Another factor as well that I think has allowed the Israeli surveillance industry to flourish has been the deliberately lax controls on Israeli intelligence, especially internal, external intelligence. And here I'm referring specifically to the conduct of Mossad, which accounts directly to the Prime Minister. There's no meaningful parliamentary, judicial, or administrative oversight, unlike Shin Bet, which has slightly more oversight than Mossad. Oversight practically does not exist in relation to Mossad's activities, which has fostered a climate of impunity. In fact, the academic literature, which traditionally has been quite conservative on issues of Israeli intelligence, has described Mossad as being risk-prone, centralized, and unaccountable. And in fact, South Africa's own domestic intelligence agency, the then National Intelligence Agency, described Mossad as being a difficult and persistent service that exercised no protocol in how they conducted themselves in South Africa, and in fact were boastful. This slide reflects some of the work that has been done by Privacy International, which is quite early work. They set up something called the Surveillance Industry Index, where they use information that is provided, product brochures, for instance, that are provided in trade fairs, and they built up a database of the export industry in that way. It's imperfect and it's quite dated, but it certainly did point to the fact that by 2016, Israel had become an extremely important exporter of surveillance tech, to the point where Israel was home to the largest amount per capita of surveillance startup companies. Another factor that has given rise to these lax controls is that Israel is not a signatory to the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is a multilateral arrangement that has brought together arms exporting countries, where they voluntarily commit to transparency and the implementation of human rights standards in the exportation of mainly conventional arms. But in 2013, in the wake of the Snowden revelations, it was also extended to spyware and IP-based surveillance as well. So Israel is not a signatory to the Wassenaar Arrangement, which automatically reduces transparency in its exports. But it claims to implement the key requirements of the Wassenaar Arrangement. And it also claims that its Ministry of Defense issues export licenses that takes human rights issues seriously. But it's become very clear in terms of the export licenses that are issued by the Ministry of Defense that it's merely just a formality that the Ministry of Defense is undertaking in order to enable the externalization of the Israeli surveillance industry. Another factor, which I think I've already touched on, is that there are many willing recipients of Israeli surveillance technologies. And these are some of the reports that our research project has produced, which reflect on some of the trends. And what we've seen across the region is there's been a lot of focus, I think, internationally on the Arab Spring and the way in which the Arab Spring was repressed so brutally. But there's been, I think, limited focus on the Southern African Spring, the wave of youth-led protests that have taken place in many Southern African countries that continue, in fact, to this day. And the surveillance tech that has been imported by governments, including from Israel, has played a very important role in boosting the ability of these governments to keep track of the protest leaders in this Southern African Spring. And we've also seen an attempt on the part of the Israeli state to engage in what has been referred to as spyware diplomacy. So in other words, where the surveillance industry is used in order to increase the influence of Israel in Africa and to weaken the pro-Palestinian movement. But I think if we look at the voting record at the United Nations, including the voting record calling for a ceasefire most recently in the United Nations General Assembly, we really need to ask ourselves, is spyware diplomacy actually having an effect? Is it actually working? Because if we look at the voting record of a country like Angola, for instance, it's very clear that Angola and other Southern African countries are taking an increasingly consistent and principled stand against Israeli apartheid and genocide. So it's difficult to say that spyware diplomacy is in fact working. So what do we do about all of this? I think is going to be a part of the conversation that we're going to be entering into in the next couple of minutes. So I think I'll leave my remarks about what we could do, including what scientists could do, for that part of the conversation. Thank you, Natalya.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that. Your talk is of particular importance this year, 2024, where more than half the world's populations are voting in democratic elections. That's more than 64 countries plus the European Union. And you've shown that not only world peace is at stake, but our democracies may be at risk as well. So what to do from here? Our next speaker might shed some light on this. I'd like to introduce Mick Napier. He's a founding member of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Committee. He has led many successful boycott activities and solidarity activism. For example, he helped to get Edward Snowden elected as rector of Glasgow University. So Mick, over to you. Thank you. Mick, you can unmute, please.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this exciting initiative by the International Union of Scientists. I have no particular scientific expertise, but I'd like to make a few points about effective campaigning. I mean, my starting point would be rather surprising, given the catastrophic killing rate in Palestine at the moment. But I want to make the point that the Palestinians have already won, and won a very long time ago, the battle for public opinion worldwide. By public opinion, I don't mean, the term international community is so misleading, but I don't mean public discourse, what one is allowed to discuss in Germany or Britain or elsewhere, but what people actually think and feel and believe when it's measured in by reputable pollsters. And it's so different from 1948 in Europe, where Israel was given the benefit of every doubt, even by sections of public opinion. And I would commend, I don't normally do this, the only thing in the BBC I normally trust is the weather forecast, but there's a poll conducted by the BBC, if I could have the slide, the other one. Yeah, a poll conducted by the BBC every year. And it finds, by asking people around the world what they think of various different countries, it finds that Israel is deeply unpopular. Now, in this poll, Israel comes bottom beneath North Korea and Iran and so on, which have atrocious press coverage in the West. Israel has a glorious press coverage, better than it should be able to expect, but still Israel comes bottom of the poll. Not always bottom, but it never gets out to the bottom four, and that's decade after decade. And the Zionists, the pro-Israel lobby, are well aware of the crisis that they face in terms of worldwide public opinion being hostile to them. And as I stress, this is not just since October last year. This goes back several decades. And the BBC is simply one example of that. In fact, I think one of the best ways to understand how deep goes the hostility towards Israel, Jane used the phrase of Israel being a threat to world peace. Well, researchers may be coming up with popular opinion in relation to that subject, not just a threat to its neighbours, and of course lethal to the Palestinians. But the European Union made a technical mistake 20 years ago, and included Israel in an opinion poll of EU citizens across every country at that time. And they were shocked by the results, because in every country, without exception, a sizable majority of citizens selected Israel from a list of 20 countries or so as the greatest threat to world peace. And the number 59% became salient in the news for a few days after that. But what was remarkable about that was not just that was the opinion of Europeans, which was allowed to come out. I think the junior official who added Israel to the list later was reprimanded, but that the EU Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Franco Frattini, apologized to Israel for the opinions of European citizens and suggested that they were quite sinister. But he went further and promised Israel that these opinions would not be allowed to influence EU policy towards Israel. Quite a remarkable public declaration. I voted to remain in the British Brexit poll, but it was without any great illusions in the EU. One final quote, one final support for the claim that the Palestinians won the battle for public opinion decisively and have maintained that over the last few decades. An organization called Global Brands Incorporated. If any of you have a spare fraction of $1 million, then Global Brands will conduct a survey worldwide about what people think of your brand. I don't think the International Union of Scientists has enough money, but if they did in a parallel universe have $1 million, they could ask Global Brands Incorporated to measure the idea in terms of public opinion worldwide. They did measure opinion towards Israel, and what they got back was absolutely remarkable. They asked the opinions of 25,000 people across the world, 36 different countries, and they reported that Israel finished bottom of the poll by a wide margin. They had never seen a result like that in terms of the unpopularity of a particular country. People were asked, what do you think of Italy, North Korea, etc., etc. Israel came bottom by the widest margin that they had ever seen. And the report that came back reported, and Israel came bottom of the ranking on almost every question. Of the 36 countries ranked, there is nowhere that respondents would like to visit less than Israel. Now, I think I found it difficult a few months ago, 6-9 months ago, to imagine how Palestinians could ever be free. It looked as if the crisis was contained in Gaza. Netanyahu was cocky, confident. And we know from anti-colonial struggles that it's a terrible cost. The colonial power in Algeria or Aden or Vietnam can kill huge numbers of people, but the killing machine doesn't always win the struggle. And the side that's much weaker militarily often wins. And it was difficult to see how this would unfold in Palestine, given the grotesque inequality. But we're beginning to see that now, that Israel is becoming what some of us realized for a while, but is becoming a pariah state. And I remember the British ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to Britain, Ron Prosor, before he was promoted to the UN, wrote a farewell article in the Telegraph here about our common democratic values. But in the article, he said that, you know, he compared Britain to a high-rise building, and he said, in the penthouse, everything's great. Our relations with corporate and political Britain are excellent. He said that every other level of the building, we got trouble. He said it was toxic anti-Israel hatred. What he meant was that people knew what Israel was doing, and public opinion was very hostile to Israel indeed. And what he said was significant. He said, if this becomes worse, then it can have implications for state-to-state relations. And I think that's what we're beginning to see around the world at the moment, that public opinion has been hostile for a very long time, but it's reaching such an intensity now that we see South Africa take Israel to the ICJ. We see other countries around the world, even Spain, and I think Belgium is on the cusp, beginning to think about expressing support and joining in the South African case. So I think that's quite significant. BBC, the European Union apologising for opinions, and the global brands analysis. And I have to stress, there's so much more. So there's every other study one looks at in terms of US support for Israel turns up a different picture to that that's presented in the mass media. What's the significance of that? I think that when we campaign, we need to have a degree of confidence. There's so many reasons for despair. I don't need to go into the genocide in Gaza, the alliance of regional Arab states with Israel effectively, and so on and so on. And our own governments, 8 months of genocide, continuing to pump weapons and continuing to give unstinting support. So there's all sorts of reasons for despair. But I think we need to bear in mind the background to this, and a very decisive background is the public opinion. That public opinion has been hostile to Israel for this very, very long time indeed. The other point I'd make is that we can make a difference. I mean, I take absolute delight in the fact that in Oakland Port in California, the biggest US port on the Pacific, Israeli ships have not been able to unload since 2014. The longshoremen, who have a very strong organization, turn every Israeli ship away, and it leaves the port with its cargo still on the ship. It has to be unloaded somewhere else. And it's a smaller version of the same approach. But the biggest arts festival in the world is held in Edinburgh every year. Not all of us who live here welcome it unambiguously, but it's a huge arts extravaganza. And once again, since 2014, the date's not accidental. It's the Operation Protective Edge and the huge massacre of a couple of thousand Palestinians. But since 2014, no Israeli cultural groups have been able to participate in the Edinburgh Festival or the Edinburgh Fringe because of popular protests and general hostility and mobilization against them. And I think if I could make a general develop from that, I think it's true to say that no Israeli cultural troops have been able to perform in Scotland since that year because of popular opposition, popular mobilization, mass emailing, protests on the ground, and so on. And I think that's our model of campaigning. And I think it's so exciting that the IUS is making its appearance, that this key constituency will be able to exert quite a significant influence. But here's my favorite story, that we can make a difference. I think that if you tell me, if you bang on about the fact that 30,000 children died last night of hunger, no access to clean water, if you talk about it a lot, it'll just depress me, and I don't really want to hear it too much, unless I can do something about it. And so I think that the key aspect of any campaign, solidarity, is not to show how terrible things are in Palestine. I think a lot of people know that, but it's to show that people can actually make a difference, and that we have the power to make that difference, not just in Auckland Port, not just in Edinburgh, but in many, many places around the world. I was involved in a campaign back in 2009, and it seemed like such a modest campaign, but the Edinburgh International Film Festival had, once again, accepted sponsorship money from the Israeli embassy. And we got a letter, a campaign of letter writing, some very moving and articulate, that were directed at the film festival. And the film festival buckled. We said we would protest not disrupt, simply protest and leaflet every event in the film festival. And we got some Arab filmmakers to support us. And they returned the money to the Israeli embassy as tainted money. And we thought that was great and went home. That was 2009. It wasn't until 6 years later that we found out that Hillary Clinton had run afoul of a federal judge by using her private email server for government business. And she was forced, very much against her will, to publish thousands of emails. Can I have the other slide? It's not a very yeah, this is the headline. You can just make it out. Clinton weighs into film festival furore. The Scotsman, a major newspaper in our little country up here, ran a front page on those emails that were published, forcibly published, which revealed that Clinton had been lobbied by some multimillionaires from Las Vegas and Hollywood to intervene, to reverse the decision in Edinburgh. And they were fulminating, they were furious, they really were spitting feathers. You have to intervene, Hillary, this can spread, this is very dangerous, and so on and so on. And they actually secretly tried to organize a boycott by producers and filmmakers of the festival. It came to nothing. And a small group in an Edinburgh church campaigning with an annual budget of about £1,000 prompted Clinton, and the emails are all public. She emailed her staff to say, please read this message and all the email traffic below. What can we do about this? Let me know if you have any ideas. And her deputy chief of staff mailed back, we will confer in the morning and come up with a plan. I don't know if they came up with a plan, but it didn't get anywhere. They tried to do, they said, bottom up and top down campaigning, and to try and organize popular demonstrations. It came to naught. And to try to get the London and the the Scottish government to take action against the boycott. And it completely failed. I think my point is that we're not supposed to know, like a swan gliding gracefully over the surface of the water, but pumping furiously underneath the water, that we can't make any difference. We're led to believe that the authorities are untouchable. And we're never supposed to know this, they get very alarmed by even a very modest activity if it's strategic and pinpoints a vulnerability. So I think if I could offer some advice, it's that we need to be clear what our audience is in campaigning. We're looking at a world where Ron Prosor, the Israeli ambassador, is quite right. He was an intelligent rascal. The corporate and the elites in Britain are very, very loyal to the Israeli state, but the popular opinion is hostile. And therefore, when we direct our publicity and our efforts, I think we need to direct it at the latter, at popular opinion, at public opinion, much lower down the social scale, in order to be successful. But I think also
Nick, thank you.
Okay. Just to
Did you
say,
want to make one last point?
Yeah, just to say, if we fight, there will be pushback. Reykjavik City Council took a policy in Iceland of full-scale BDS, and the heavens fell on them. American banks threatened to crush them, and they were forced to retreat. So the basis that we have should be one where we are not vulnerable to that kind of funding pressure and corporate pressure.
Thank you, Mick, for those very important points, showing us that activism does work, but we must be open and ready for the pushback. So our next part, I'd just like to go back to Matt Mahmoudi and ask, Matt, how does your research rely on activism and your personal experiences of activism?
Thank you, Natalya. So our research works in communication with the activism that a lot of Palestinian campaigners and rights advocates have already been carrying out over the past many years. Folks like Al-Haq, Who Profits, B'Tselem, Hamle, many organizations that have been doing incredible work to map a lot of the surveillance architecture that exists within the Palestinian territories, and working together on reinforcing a lot of the findings from that and building on it to figure out exactly how widely this web is spread. Insofar as activists have been doing with us so far, we've also been talking to activists that are currently challenging a lot of what's going on at big tech companies. As some of you may have been aware or heard recently, Google and others have been under a lot of scrutiny for the supply of cloud-based infrastructure that is being used allegedly by Israeli authorities for military services, military operations in the ongoing unfolding genocide in Gaza. And in this context, Google workers in particular have been very, very unequivocal in their demand for Google to stop developing these technologies and stop selling it to Israeli authorities. And here it's been really important to plug into those demands. And I think we can learn a lot from what activists across the big tech companies are doing, workers that are refusing to actually develop those products, workers who are calling into question their own company's complicity in potentially breaking with the provisional measures that were announced by the International Court of Justice, and in potentially embroiling themselves with wider implications for complicity later on when it comes to the ongoing violations that are being committed against Palestinians. So I think, again, we build stronger unions and our ability to tap into research and advocacy that both hits companies that are involved, institutions that regulate those companies that are involved, domestic legislation where those can be used to possibly impart prohibitions on the development of particular technologies. And we can really only do that by working together with activists who are already building on and doing this work.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks for that. Jane, do you have anything to tell us about activism for scientists or people working in the science space?
Yes, sure. There's a lot that can be said about this particular issue. Is it possible to call up the slides again? Right, okay. So I think one of the things that really needs to happen at the moment, and I think we're in a very strong position internationally for the reasons that Mick has gone into, to be able to win this demand, which is to demand a two-way embargo against Israeli spyware and the military-industrial complex more generally. So in other words, no sales of conventional weapons or dual-use goods to Israel, and no purchasing of weapons and dual-use goods from Israel. So in other words, I think that we are in a position at the moment to be able to escalate the activism to make the surveillance industry globally unviable. And I think what that means is that countries should be pressured to rescind their export licenses to Israel, and also to block imports as well, especially given the fact that Israel is now under investigation for war crimes and for genocide. But I think we need to go beyond that as well. And I think we also need to look at what an alternative vision could be for the weapons industry, and what should happen to it. And I think there we can take inspiration from the anti-war movement that traditionally has tended to focus on conventional arms, but I think it does provide us with some kind of alternative vision for how to depart from a militaristic growth path that Israel benefits so much from. And there are examples historically where scientists have worked on transforming a destructive industry, the arms industry, into constructive work, into an industry that is involved in socially responsible, necessary, and useful work. And there I'd like to provide the example of the Lucas Plan, which was a plan developed by the Lucas aerospace workers in the 1970s in the UK, who were facing retrenchment because their company was under threat of being closed down. And what they did was they started a shop floor discussion on what they could do in order to use their engineering and scientific skills to more socially useful ends. So they set out a written plan which attempted to re-envision how scientific skills were used by society. And all right, this particular quote will date the Lucas Plan somewhat, but they did say that in the plan, in the preamble to the plan, that there is something seriously wrong about a society which can produce a level of technology to design and build the Concorde. Remember the Concorde, but cannot provide enough simple urban heating systems to protect the old age pensioners who are dying each winter from hypothermia. So what they did was they came up through extensive shop floor discussions with 150 alternative products where their engineering and scientific skills could be put to more constructive uses. So this included submersible vehicles for marine agriculture, to alternative braking systems and energy storage solutions. And I think these kinds of ideas are apposite for dual-use goods as well, including the spyware industry. And I think that this in turn could be a way of ensuring that jobs are not only saved, but in fact created and are sustainable as they are aimed at meeting broader societal needs. Now, I don't think we can argue that surveillance capabilities, even in the best of circumstances, aren't needed. They are needed, but they need to be based on a reasonable suspicion of criminality in order to be used. And the abuse of surveillance technologies is a worldwide problem, to the point where the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and opinion has called for an immediate moratorium on the global sale and transfer of the tools of the private surveillance industry, which of course sees Israel being at the helm of. And I think also Edward Snowden has gone further and argued that spyware will be regulated only if you remove the profit motive in actually producing it, which implies that any production should actually take place under public ownership. And in fact, he has made the argument, he's made the analogy that we don't allow a commercial market in nuclear weapons. So he's argued that the commercial spyware industry just generally is an industry that shouldn't exist and should be banned. And I think doing so would go a long way to addressing the thriving market in the exploitation of vulnerabilities in our communications, which Israel has become so adept at commercializing. And I think in the process of doing that, it will remove a key pillar of the war economy that allows Israel to continue with well, certainly impunity up to this point, perhaps no more. It allows it to continue the occupation and industrial scale repression and genocide.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane, for that. Those are real important issues and lots to think about. So our time is going. We have many questions from the chat. So I'd just like to point out, we won't have time to deal with all of these questions, but I'm hoping that participants can use our website and carry on this debate and discussion with each other. So we're just going to start with some questions, and then
Yes.
Manab, in about 10 minutes, I will read out the other questions, and then we will continue this conversation offline. So Manab, please.
Yes. So thank you very much. I really thank all the speakers for these valuable inputs. So my first question would be to Matt. What is the role of Silicon Valley and the tech companies in general in the purposing of tech products for military users? If you can shed some light on that.
Thank you so much, Manab. So I don't think it's entirely new to folks at Silicon Valley, and technology corporations globally have been involved in enabling apartheid and reinforcing apartheid and providing really the raw materials that then are plugged into systems that are developed within Israel to impart surveillance, to impart other forms of automated violence against Palestinians. Two of the companies that I've mentioned before include TKH Security, which is a Dutch company. It's a manufacturer of surveillance hardware. There's Hikvision, which is a China-based surveillance manufacturer that develops facial recognition capable cameras. Both of those companies have been supplying much of the camera infrastructure that takes, I think, predominantly the position of some of the most prolific camera infrastructure that exists within the context of East Jerusalem. Without those cameras, the Mabat 2000 system could not run. Yet those companies continue to be present within the occupied Palestinian territories. One very, very concrete action that can be taken as on the back of that, in line with what Jane was saying before as well, is to simply ban their exports. They're developing technologies that are incompatible with international human rights law, with international humanitarian law, and that could, given pending, of course, the final ruling of the International Court of Justice, also be seen as part and parcel of the unfolding genocide. So stopping those exports will be imminently important. Then there is a question of, what other wider Silicon Valley companies are potentially involved. We've heard time and time again about the cloud infrastructure, the Nimbus infrastructure that's being developed by Google and by Amazon, which is a cloud platform that gives you access to many of the backlog APIs that sit within Google's cloud infrastructure and within Amazon's web services, as well as a slew of other tools that we know are being contracted for by the Ministry of Defense. By giving access to this platform, what Google and Amazon are potentially doing is scaling up the Ministry of Defense's capabilities to carry out surveillance, automated forms of target list generation, catastrophic, like the ones we've heard about, including Lavender and the Gospel system, enabling the Israeli authorities to continue to reinforce aspects of both apartheid as well as the unfolding genocide against Palestinians. By not having those cloud platforms, we're infinitely, again, making it more difficult for Israeli authorities to continue their current policies against Palestinians. And so it's part of weakening the apartheid system. We have to stop those contracts from being carried to fruit. And the way we do that, in part, is by supporting the tech worker resistance that are calling for the dropping of the contracts. But it's also by bringing to attention to our governments, other governments, third-party states that also have responsibilities under the Genocide Convention to actively prevent genocide, to stop dealing or enabling or to exert, at the very least, pressure on the companies that are supplying these technologies, including Amazon and Google.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. Yes, Natalya, please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to read out a number of questions. The first one is from Fadi from Palestine. Has anyone done a mapping of all the Israeli surveillance tech companies, and should such research be done, and said companies be sanctioned? Is there an effort to block financial investments in Israeli surveillance companies? Linked to that, there's another question about from Dhruba from India. We've heard that India obtained Pegasus from Israel to be used for snooping. Should the use of AI in warfare be formally banned? And there's another that links to another question on Pegasus that's been used in India. There's another question. So Matt, you'll talk to Fadi's question just now, yeah? And then there's another question I have for Jane. Who gets to profit by all these wars at the cost of human lives? Is it the industrial military complex? And what is the nature of this complex? Does it have a multinational character? Is it countries or corporations? Thank you. Matt, you can talk to Fadi's question.
Of course. Thank you so much, Natalya, and thank you, Fadi, for the question. To answer your question, there's been mapping efforts across the surveillance industry within the context of the Palestinian territories for years. And really some of the organizations that were first out doing this, in particular in relation to biometric surveillance, have included Who Profits, Al-Haq, the Hebron Apartheid Project, and also Amnesty International. As a part of these efforts, again, some of the infrastructure is visible, and Palestinians and researchers are able to map them by going around, taking pictures of them, using cameras, documenting the model names of the particular devices in question. But some of the infrastructure is also not always visible, right? A lot of the surveillance infrastructure that is used, whether it's for social media monitoring or whether we're talking about spyware, are either obfuscated, sits sort of somewhat invisibly on devices that need to undergo forensic analysis, or are being used behind walls of protections against freedom of information requests that make it incredibly difficult to acquire those surveillance capabilities. With that said, there have been coalitions between Palestinians' rights organizations and folks that have status that allows them to submit freedom of information requests to Israeli authorities, as well as through picking up through forensic analysis of spyware that has infected human rights defender phones in particular. And for that, I'd defer you also to the work of our security lab at Amnesty, who not only have inspected many devices to give us a better sense of how spyware is spreading, but who also have a toolkit available that allows human rights defenders and folks, including those who are on this call, to check their own devices or whether they've been infected. But this is just to say that there are a number of different organizations that are involved in these efforts. Al-Haq in particular and Who Profits, in fact, developed a database that's available on their site that shows many of the different companies that have been involved. The question of keeping these databases updated as the State of Israel continues to expand the corporate partnerships that it draws on in order to provide these infrastructures is a more difficult question. And so any research that's able to shed light on this by investigative journalists in particular, which we've been seeing in the last few years especially, is tremendously helpful in keeping civil society afloat and apace with the latest on this surveillance front. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Matt. That's really useful, and I hope you'll visit the site to look at that. So, Jane, you've 2 minutes to answer a very, very big question.
Yes, I think people in Palestine are definitely being used in order to battle test surveillance tech in the occupied Palestinian territories. And, Matt has touched on that. And Anthony Lowenstein, I think, has also written the definitive book on this particular issue. What we've attempted to look at is the ways in which it's being battle tested further afield in countries of the world where there's been very little documentation of these issues. But who benefits from, or who profits from this battle testing? I think there's a range of actors that profit. I think Silicon Valley and the big tech companies through providing the cloud services and other systems for the maintenance of the occupation. And I think that there has been some work that's been done on this in the past couple of weeks. I think governments that have a vested interest in stabilizing their increasingly restive populations. And I think I've touched on some of that in my presentation. And then there's a range of private actors as well. So, for instance, the Isabel dos Santoses of the world have a vested interest in continuing to keep the lifeline of Israeli tech and spies available to so that they can continue to benefit from corrupt contracts in their respective localities. I think our challenge now is to raise the cost of buying Israeli surveillance tech such that the disadvantages and the downsides far outweigh the advantages, including the profits that are to be made.
Thanks, Jane. You did well with a big question. So, I mean, it talks well to a question from Michael from the USA about ways in which radical scientists and engineers can use our knowledge and skills to engage in forms of counter-surveillance. This also talks to Dibya Sankar's question about social media, and are the social media companies obliged to serve the interest of any specific government? Who controls them? We've run out of time, unfortunately. I'll leave the last word for Manab for his thoughts and comments and close the meeting. Thank you very much.
So shall we proceed to conclude the webinar, Natalya?
Manab, you can just talk to your last question.
Oh, yes. So obviously this involves the role of scientists in particular. And I think this question can be asked to all of you. So what I wanted to say is, like, the major part of our scientific research is funded by Department of Defense or private military industries to produce new war weapons and with ever higher lethal capacities. Many scientists and engineers, knowingly or unknowingly, being part of that research. Now, are not we, the scientists and engineers, complicit in killing innocent people in war and genocide, say the one brought down in Gaza? What would be your message to these scientists and engineers? Any one of you, please start. Maybe yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I think particularly for scientists who don't quite know where to start with all of this, there's an excellent set of guidelines that have been developed by Palestinian civil society, which is, and specifically the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, that I think could also be applied to scientific activities, particularly research activities. And I think they're fairly unambiguous. I think they're consistent and coherent. I can place the link in the chat just now. And they've been designed such in order to counter any accusations that boycotts may be pursued for anti-Semitic reasons. So for instance, if conferences are taking place where Israeli scientists have been invited, or if there is a funding collaboration, for instance, that may involve Israeli institutions, it's very helpful to apply the PACB boycott and the principles that it enumerates in order to take a decision about how to respond. So, for instance, it sets out the fact that the boycott should be institutionalized rather than individual. If there's funding by the Israeli state, for instance, that promotes the normalization of Israel in the international community, then those kinds of research activities could potentially be boycottable. If funding is being used in order to promote brand Israel, then those potentially are boycottable activities. But I think it also makes provision for common sense boycotts where if Israeli researchers, for instance, engage in activities that are clearly supportive of the occupation, individuals, in other words, that don't necessarily have any direct structural, institutional, or funding links with the Israeli military-industrial complex, for instance, but engage in activities that are clearly supportive of the occupation and the genocide, that would amount to a common sense boycott, to not collaborate with that person, for instance. So I think being guided by Palestinian civil society and the will of what the Palestinians want, which has been crystallized into the PACB guidelines, I think could be one way to approach these very difficult questions.
Thank you, Jen. Matt or Meek, if you want to add something to this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Manab. I'm happy to go next. So I think one really important point is to not assume inevitability. These technologies are not the result of some unstoppable will of natural law, and they can be stopped. And I think this is something that we've learned time and time again, but it's come to some great leap of scientific process, and we've realized that actually, as a matter of fact, they do perpetuate certain forms of human rights violations that we simply find unconscionable. And so in that respect, I'd also say it is the duty of scientists in this respect to engage in international processes that are calling for bans of exports of these technologies, of the development of these technologies, to make their voices heard when they have concerns about how these technologies are being used. In particular, there are a number of special procedures as a part of the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that are actively soliciting and looking for unsolicited inputs from the scientific community about the various human rights impacts of the technologies that they are the experts on. And so I would say, again, it bears a tremendous amount of weight coming from the scientific community to call out and bring to the fore the ways in which the products that they're engaged in researching and developing are being used in these reprehensible ways. So to continue to speak up, to continue to call for a stop of the ongoing apartheid and the unfolding genocide of Palestinians, and the ways in which these technologies feed into those events.
Thank you, Matt. Meek, if you have some points to add here. Okay, you have to unmute yourself.
Briefly, Jane alluded to the Lucas plan. We see in Britain at the moment young activists, and not always young, smashing up arms factories, closing down Israeli arms factories one after the other, and sometimes risking a few years in prison in doing so. Generally, juries support them, but not always. And it seems to me that when we go outside arms factories, there's another model as well, which is for large numbers of people to actually blockade the entrances to arms companies. But specifically, the first tactic is liable to state repression. And I think when we encounter arms workers, we have a major problem. And some latter-day version of the Lucas plan to begin that conversation about these factories being repurposed, just as there's a wide conversation about repurposing them for a green revolution, we need another political discussion. And I think the IUS could play a significant role in that. The opening remarks were, you were a group of scientists and engineers, to open up that political discussion, because my own government has called for an arms embargo, but it wouldn't touch the argument about repurposing arms factories.
Thank you, Meek. And this is exactly the reason because of which we established this international platform of scientists. Okay, so Natalya,
I think Matt's got a short point to make, and then Manab, you can close.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I was just going to say before we close, there are two questions in the chat room that maybe we can put to the guests if we have a little bit of extra time.
Okay, Matt first, and then we'll ask the question. We'll get the questions.
And I think this in part, thank you, Natalya. I think this in part answers one of the questions that's been posed. First of all, just to say that, as Shruti pointed out in the comments, that there has been an ongoing protest and mobilization globally at universities across the world, really starting in the United States and beyond, to call for breaking the complicity of universities and the higher education sector with the unfolding genocide in Gaza, which I think is an incredibly important movement that also, again, scientists and researchers in particular could do well with supporting, not least because the many ways in which the relationships between what is going on in Gaza and apartheid at large are relationships between research institutions, companies that are developing the architecture that is often being used for artificial intelligence, for surveillance, and in different ways and in other ways within the context of the occupied Palestinian territories by the Israeli authorities. So really being a part of those encampments and supporting those demands and helping also students expose the ways in which particular research projects are plugged into particular products that impart particular forms of violence, as we've discussed in today's talk, are really, really important and noteworthy way in which scientists can support the ongoing struggle. Just wanted to emphasize that point, just because these encampments are ongoing. And of course, universities are currently reaching the point of the summer holidays, which will possibly see a strategic moment to silence the ongoing protests and the ongoing demands. And I think, again, we as academics also have a duty to continue amplifying those voices, even as we go into a quieter period at universities worldwide.
Thanks, Matt, for these valuable points. Yes, so as you can see, the question pops up on the window. So this is about social media. In particular, it says that it is observed many times that reach of social media posts with Israel or Gaza, etc., in the caption are intentionally suppressed. And in this context, is it controlled by Israel administration or by social media companies itself? Are social media companies obliged to serve the interest of any specific government? If any one of you would like to take up.
Well, maybe some good news. I recall a couple of months ago, an Israeli internet research company published results of a study of TikTok and Instagram over 1 month, I think it was. And they found 9 billion posts that were tagged pro-Israel and 112 billion that were tagged pro-Palestine. So I think despite the rooms full of soldiers being paid to post, Israel is losing out on social media. I mean, obviously there are areas where you would qualify that, but is losing out massively in terms of posts on social media.
Thank you. Yeah, Matt.
Just to plug into this as well, I do think it's important to note that there have been measures that have been taken by companies that have been asymmetrically skewed towards silencing pro-Palestine speech. We've published a number of statements and reports on this, as have Hamle, which is a Palestinian organization, as well as Human Rights Watch. I think it's important to pay attention to these reports in particular, because we see the ways in which overbroad censorship has been deployed by social media platforms, including Meta, that have seen any instances that have mentioned Palestine, sometimes even just names like Al-Aqsa or Gaza, and either silence them for being picked up by the algorithm as a potential form of hate speech, or actively sought to shadow ban the accounts that have been involved in spreading that pro-Palestinian content. In part, we saw this as a result of, for example, Meta moving the threshold for what they consider a violence online from 80%, which is normally the required threshold to meet for a set of indicators, down to 20% for any content stemming from the broader Middle East, North Africa region, and from content stemming from the occupied Palestinian territories in relation to pro-Palestinian content and material. So we see those policies at play, and we have to challenge them. And we know that human rights organizations and digital rights organizations actively are, but it does not change the fact that there are more documented instances of hate speech at the moment, according to Hamle, that have been lodged against Palestinians, especially in Hebrew language, than there has been in other content. Part of it has also been the result of design and policy decisions taken by social media companies that have, for example, seen a very delayed development of a Hebrew language violence classifier, which was only really in the process of being developed towards the end of last year, which means that a ton of content that's being written about and against Palestinians has not been captured up until very recently. So I do think the question that is being posed is an important one, and we have to pay attention to the ways in which social media, in spite of maybe the political narrative being on the side of Palestinians, it is actively posing and exposing Palestinians to a slew of violence and anti-Palestinian racism online.
Well, Matt, if I want to ask one more question related to this one, like what motivates these tech companies like Meta and so to act in this asymmetric manner? Is it like something they're getting some pressure from the governments, or maybe they have some interest associated with Israel or something? What do you think?
So to be clear, social media companies are beholden to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which include their which must also involve the monitoring of possible human rights violations that it could occur as a result of any part of the entire life cycle of the technology product that they're developing under conflict context, such as those that we're witnessing here. They have a responsibility for heightened due diligence, which means they have to be extra attentive to the ways in which they're contributing to human rights harms. That does foreclose, in reality, the possibility of social media companies being beholden to governments' requests for particular behaviors when it comes to stemming people's freedom of expression or assembly online, though there have been a number of instances in which we know there have been requests by governments for takedown of particular forms of content. Now, in accordance, if these companies are to be in accordance with international law, they would need to ensure that they are enabling the freedom of expression and that they are actively stemming also at the same time the spread and incitement to violence and hatred that might be committed by certain actors. And so again, this is not answering your question in a straightforward way, but it is to say that yes, governments have historically exerted influence on the policies of social media companies, but that social media companies have responsibilities under international law that, if followed, would prevent them from doing so.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying this. Yes. So Natalya. There is another question. Natalya, if you can kindly take it up.
I think this question, Shruti's question, Matt has spoken to. We hear, Matt, is that correct? Yeah, I think we've spoken to this one. We've gone over time. There's been a very rich and wonderful discussion. I think Mick's point was very important, that as scientists and engineers, we are still members of our communities that we work in and that we live in, and therefore working with trade union movements, working with our next door neighbors, and working outside of our silos with other scientists is going to give us a lot of strength and I think a lot of success in our solidarity activism and our activism. I think that there are and then just to add, I think there's an important link here from Daniela. There's a website, Who Profits, a database of complicit companies, if you can look on the chat for that. And then Manab, I'll hand it over to you to close. I'd just like to thank all our speakers for myself, and Manab can close. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also request if our website can be called up. Yeah. Okay. So we are already running out of time. And firstly, I would like to extend my thanks to Jane, Matt, and Mick for their insightful discussions. I also thankfully acknowledge the active participation of our audience, which made this webinar interactive and engaging. The discussion highlighted the disquieting use of information technology for destructive ends, leading to tragic loss of innocent lives and violation of every democratic right of the Palestinian people. It is a crime against humanity. With the rise in funding for scientific and technological research aimed at military applications, we are confronted with our role in pervasive weaponization of our innovations. This trend drives the escalation of regional and global conflicts through a complex military-industrial framework. Modern science and technology, from advancing lethal weaponry and intrusive surveillance methods to enhancing AI capabilities of weapons, are increasingly utilized in ways that dehumanize and endanger human life. Methods perfected in international conflicts are now applied domestically to restrict freedoms, suppress dissent, and perpetrate severe human rights violations. The increasing allocation of research and development funds for military purposes by major imperialist powers has reshaped the global arms race into a competition using scientific and technological advancements. As scientists and engineers, we are the workforce behind these advancements. It is now imperative that we take a principled stand against participation in this industrial military complex and strive for a world where our scientific endeavors would serve humanity's interest, promoting values of life, mutual respect, community stewardship, and preservation of our planet. However, this endeavor cannot be achieved by individual effort. We must unite, organize, and collectively act to fulfill our responsibility in safeguarding humanity and the planet. With this objective, we have established the International Union of Scientists and urge you to join this global platform, contributing together towards our shared goal. You may join us by signing in or subscribing to our website, as you can see on the screen. As we conclude, I once again extend my sincere thanks to Jane, Matt, Meek for graciously sparing their time and delivering insightful presentation during this webinar. A special thanks to our audience whose engagement was instrumental in making this event a success. I thank Natalya for her exceptional coordination effort and Adam for setting up and taking care of online and web platforms. And also I thank Flavio and Rajeshik for their technical support. Lastly, I thank the organizing committee members of the International Union of Scientists for making this webinar possible. With this, we close our webinar today and look forward to having you on board in our efforts for a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.